Hello, Tuesday. We're going to go to Cullen Roche, Prague Cap, to educate us a bit further and give us a couple of those economic facts that any Homus economicus must have. Economic must-haves for every man and woman that wants to talk about economic things. Let's crack into it and see how we go. Bond traders, this is basically where we're going, is bond trading. Bond traders are a simple species. If you offer them a low-risk arbitrage opportunity, they will almost always jump on it. And we're not particularly going there, but that's part of it, obviously. But we've been there, we should understand that. But there's an intricate dance that occurs in the US government bond market. Before we dive into the details, it is important to understand why the US government even borrows money in the first place. This is where we're going as one of our first must-have facts. We are going to try and understand why the US government even borrows money in the first place. After all, the government could, theoretically, just print up its own money and spend it. And the USA has at times done precisely that. Of course, that's not what the US government now does. Instead, the US government outsources the creation of money to its banking system, the private sector, in a design structure that is in keeping with a capitalist economy. See, they kind of outsourced it to the private sector because it's a private sector capitalist economy, the American one. But if it was a more communist, socialist driven, dirigiste government, they might want to just do it themselves. But for appearance's sake, they outsource it to the private sector. The US money supply is essentially privatized to an oligopoly of private entities in an attempt to create a competitive market-based, demand-driven money system. So the government makes itself a user of money in this regard. So for the whole look of it, the capitalist-looking state says, you create the money and we'll use the money you create. But as we'll see, they don't just give it to the private system and let it run. It's still very, very plugged into the private system is the state. So the government makes itself a user of money in this regard. It must obtain funds from the private sector before it can spend. It achieves this via taxation, bond sales. In a representative republic like the United States, we essentially choose to move resources to the public domain for the public purpose. Then I think I miss out a chapter, paragraph, and then we move on to this paragraph. On the bond side, the US government has a very specific design structure. First of all, primary dealers are required to bid at Treasury bond auctions and must maintain reasonable markets in US government debt. In other words, your private sector, you can do your private demand-driven thing, but you turn up at these auctions and you make sure that these auctions are well attended and orderly. Okay, now on my link number 2, which I won't say anything about, I've got the list of primary dealers. I'll give them out quickly here. Bank of Nova Scotia, BMO, BNP, Barclays, Cantor Fitzgerald, Citigroup, Credit Suisse, Daiwa, Deutsche Bank, Goldman, HSBC, Jefferies, maybe not. There was action at Jefferies yesterday. JP Morgan Securities, Merrill Lynch, Mizuho Securities, Morgan Stanley, Nomura, RBC, RBS, SG Americas, UBS are the primary dealers. So I'll start again on that chapter. Now we know who the primary dealers are. On the bond side, the US government has a very specific design structure. First of all, primary dealers, who we now know, are required to bid at Treasury bond auctions and must maintain reasonable markets in government debt. That's just part of the deal when working with the government, which is lucrative for the banks in various ways. As I often point out, you'll notice in the details of the bond or of the auction results that the auctions seem predetermined. That's because they essentially are. The Fed, Treasury and the dealers all work together in close unison to ensure that the auctions can be filled. The dealers, being required to bid, will always be able to take down the entire auction and can usually take down twice the auction. Again, that's by design. If you check the data, you will see this is just about always the case. It doesn't matter how much China is buying or how much individuals are buying via Treasury Direct. Auctions are designed not to fail. So they don't. Right, those are the two out of the article. The link's obviously there. You can read the rest of the article. I'll drag a couple of. I thought I had 2 comments, but it looks as though I've only got 1. Excuse me, cough, cough. So the end of a comment was, of course, OT2, which is Operation Twist 2, which is kind of in the air now as well, is completely unnecessary. The Fed doesn't really need to borrow anything. But appearance matters. OT2 doesn't look like printing money as much as QE does, but that's a kind of a different subject. But I put it there as well to show that how many things are done just for show. And yes, this is to keep the confidence of everybody. If they didn't do these for show things, if they just went, oh well, of course we don't need to play this game where we just print the money up and give you the money. Obviously that looks sloppy, so they like to keep it looking tidy, and most things that look tidy, they try to keep them just like they were yesterday and the day before, so things don't change, because people like things not to change too much. Cullen Roche, Pragcap, replies, the Fed controls the short end, the bills, the Treasury bills, 1 year, 2 year, up to 5 year, let's say, for the short end, now via interest on reserves. It controls it via interest on reserves. When they want to raise the federal funds rate, they won't need to sell off their balance sheet, because this is the problem. What do you do when you sell off the balance sheet? It's going to tear things apart. They'll raise the rate on the reserves instead. Now, this is the first time I've ever seen this written down. And it was a little joy for Mystic. I can envisage, generally my amusement goes via Russ Roberts, that if the interest on reserves goes up to 0.5%, he'll be really confused. But if it goes up to, say, 2.5%, this is probably hypothetical because other things will happen before they have to get to this point. But if the Fed was paying 2.5% on reserves, that would be to get the interest rate up. Now, people would be struggling to understand it. But do I need to go into why it happens? No, I don't, I'm sure. Because if you don't know why it happens, the chances are I wouldn't be able to explain it to you. Normally, the Federal Reserve, a central bank, will control the amount that banks charge each other for overnight lending by controlling the amount of reserves that they have. They control the amount of reserves, because if they've got lots of reserves, if there's lots of reserves out there and all of them have got reserves, well, you can just phone round and get a really good deal, and then the rate really comes down. Or it's sloppy because there's so much money out there. But if the central bank has controlled just the amount of money that's out there by giving them incentives, these small arbitrage, little cuts of money that they can make over a short amount of time, by either selling them treasuries, so their money then comes into the central bank, so it's not available for overnight lending, or if they want more money out there, so the rate comes down, to actually then swap it round the other way. So there is more money out there, and this is what I call the silly way of doing it, because it just seems, but that's the way it had normally happened. But obviously now the banks have got such huge reserves stacked up that getting to the point where you'd be able to force interest rates up via the overnight borrowing rate between banks, it's too far in the distance, because you'd have to get the central bank would have to get those reserves numbers down to reasonable amounts that would force the difference in the overnight lending rate between the banks. But everyone's got so much money that it takes so long to get it down that you wouldn't get the interest rates up in the meantime. So the way you do it is just say to the banks, well, I'll give you 2%, the equivalent it would be, because the interest paid on reserves is paid on a longer period, but the equivalent of 2.5% overnight. So no bank would ever do an overnight lend to another bank at less than 2.5%, when you can just leave the money with the central bank, and that would force interbank lending to 2.5% plus a little bit by paying interest on reserves. Did I do that? I don't know. But as I said before, if you don't understand it, you probably wouldn't have understood the explanation. So I think there's a lot of very facts in there, and they're just absolutely good to have. And Cullen Roche has been very good to us, sorting these things out and explaining them in such an easy way. And knowing how the bond market works is a very important basic thing to have in mind, and we don't have to know the whole thing. I would say that basically what I've said today is a good enough basis for most all people. So that's it. Bye.